Hello. My name is Charles Kramer. I'm on J Street's board, and I'm delighted to see you all here today. In May this year, I took part in the J Street leadership mission to Israel and the Palestinian territory. It was an extraordinary experience. Our delegation met with many well-established Israeli and Palestinian leaders who are quite familiar to us. But we also had the opportunity to meet with a number of bright and dynamic Palestinian and Israeli leaders who were new to us. We were enormously impressed. These men and women came from different backgrounds, but all had one thing in common: a bold vision for the future of Israel and Palestine. We were so inspired by these encounters that we decided to bring some of these leaders to Washington to meet with us today. Welcome to the New Voices, New Perspectives plenary. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests. Samar Maalouf is the executive director of One Voice Palestine, part of an international grassroots movement that amplifies the voices of the Israeli and Palestinian moderate majority, empowering them to propel their elected representatives towards ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on a two-state solution. Samer is also the head organizer of the Apricot Festival, one of the largest cultural festivals in Palestine. Prior to his post at One Voice, Maalouf served as head of Ramallah's Al-Kasbah Theater and Cinematheque programs. Riman Barakat is the co-CEO of the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, otherwise known as IPCRI. Mikhael Manekin is the Director of Policy and Communications at the new progressive think tank, Molad, the Center for a Renewal of Israeli Democracy. In the past, he co-directed the Israeli veterans group, Breaking the Silence. Scott Mortman lives in Israel, where he counsels and represents both established and emerging companies. Most recently, he served as the Director of Global Business Development for Better Place, Inc., the Israel-based electric vehicle services company. Member of Knesset Stav Shaffir of Israel's Labour Party, is a journalist and social activist, and is one of the leaders of the Israeli social movement that brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets in the summer of 2011. Since 2013, she has been a member of the Knesset, serving on the Finance and Budget Committees. Dr. Husam S. Zomlot is the Executive Deputy Commissioner of the Fatah Commission for International Affairs and currently serves as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. His work experience includes the United Nations, Oxford Research Group, the London School of Economics, and the Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute. He most recently contributed to a book entitled State Formation in Palestine, Viability and Governance During a Social Transformation. Moderating the discussion is Roger Cohen, who has one of the best-known and best-respected bylines in journalism. As a reporter and now opinion writer for the New York Times, he has won universal admiration for his trenchant writing, in which he invariably stands up for the causes of peace, reason, justice, and coexistence. Prior to his current appointment, Cohen was a foreign editor of the Times U.S. office and then senior editor of the International Herald Tribune. Let us welcome Roger Cohen.
Thank you very much, Charles. I don't know about universal admiration, but I'll take it anyway. Thank you. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, something did shift in the Middle Eastern arena quite substantially this week, and that was the President of the United States spoke to a President of Iran. But when it comes to Israel-Palestine, things often seem stuck. We hear about the peace process, which doesn't lead to peace and doesn't seem to be much of a process. We now have 9 months of negotiations already engaged. Perhaps the period of 9 months was chosen because it would suggest that it would lead to a birth, but we don't know if that's going to happen. We hear about security, we hear about the 1967 lines, land swaps, possible reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, but one can't help the feeling that things are stuck. So what we've done here is we've brought in some new voices, younger voices, to try and examine whether beneath this rather frozen, often somewhat depressing surface, in fact, things are moving. And perhaps I could begin with you, Stav. As you look at all this, and as you hear the discussions once again about the need for a two-state solution, the last chance for Israel to remain Jewish and democratic, does your heart sink, or do you feel, from your perspective, that something is changing, that there is cause to invest these talks with a little more confidence and hope than one might?
You know, change is a very interesting thing. 2 years ago, if you came to the average Israeli and you asked just a person on the street whether they can imagine any change in our society, so probably everybody, 99%, I mean, except for the crazy and the too optimistic people, 99% would tell you nothing is going to happen. Everything is stuck. If you want to have a future, maybe you should think about moving to someplace else. You know, my friend has just moved to America, and da-da-da-da. You hear these stories all the time. And when I went to when we pitched the first tents in the Rothschild Boulevard, we didn't expect any change to really happen. We were activists. We were dreaming, and we organized demonstrations, and we went on the streets, but we never expected people to actually show up. We never expected Israelis to really do something big for their future. But then it happened. I mean, and it felt like witnessing a miracle. It felt like there is no, I don't know who of you were there in the big rallies that brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets, that brought 500,000 Israelis at the end, the peak rally, to protest for social justice. But the feeling that everybody shared, and that's not only for the optimistic of us, because the optimists always share that feeling, but the thing that everybody shared was, okay, I'm part of a moment that is a history changer. Now, I'm asking myself all the time whether we can have that moment in peace, whether we can really make the connection, not just by talking about it, but by showing it on the streets, in our policies, by changing the discourse, the connection between social justice and peace. And there is no way to answer that question but to know that we have to try. That we have to try again and again and again. And if there's something that and we don't know which one of these experiences or experiments will work. And what I'm asking myself again is whether we're trying. I look at my generation in Israel and Palestine, and I see a lot of people who are leaving. I see a lot of people who are moving out. I see a lot of people who are, if they're staying, they're moving out of politics. They don't want to touch politics. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They gave up. They gave up on that dream for real independency, for real freedom, for real democracy. They just gave up. And I don't think we're doing, as a generation, I don't think we're doing enough work to make it happen. We're not doing enough work to make this negotiation process work. We're not doing enough to push our leadership to take real action, to make a real, honest, and brave political decision and change the history.
Why not? I mean, President Obama, when he was in Israel quite recently, he made more or less a direct appeal to your generation to do just that. And it was quite striking during the protest movements also that you didn't really draw a direct connection between the cost of the occupation and some of the economic impact in Israel. It was almost like you were trying to keep that movement and peace movement apart. Now you seem to be saying we should try to get the same enthusiasm for peace. Do you think that's possible? Could you see a similar wave of enthusiasm?
I have to say that I don't feel comfortable with trying to excuse our need for peace by talking about the economical effects of the situation. It's not the economy that's the reason for peace. It's our future. It's not even only about security. I know it's not a popular say for a politician to say, but it's not only that. There are the reasons. There is a severe influence of the economy and the money that is invested in the settlements on our economical situation, the money that is invested in security on our economical situation. There is an influence on our society. There's an influence definitely on our security. But the reason we need peace is not that. We need peace because it's the right thing to do. We need peace because that dream that our grandparents brought to our country, the dream that we were born to continue, the dream that we're here for, is still not accomplished. Right. That's why we need it. That we don't need to look for other excuses. We don't need to fall into the terminology of the right that's forcing us to look for excuses for why we need it. No, we need it because that's the right thing for Israel to do.
Scott, I think, yeah, you wanted to just...
No, I think she raises a very good point, but I think we shouldn't neglect the fact that there is a very strong economic argument for peace, and I don't think it's put forward strong enough, particularly with those people that are arguing for a one-state solution and annexation, which is that, you know, from an economic perspective, if you look right now at the annual per capita GDP in Israel, it's about $30,000 per year, roughly. If you look at that same GDP per capita in the future Palestinian state, it's about $3,000. So if the people who are promoting annexation are serious about a one-state solution, you have two alternatives. Either you have a true apartheid state, which will be untenable, or you bring the Palestinians in and we become a single community, in which case you have to say to the Israelis, particularly those that are making this argument, are you prepared to give up your pension? Are you prepared to develop equal education, equal health care? Because if you're not prepared to do all these things, then you're not serious about a single state. And then the only alternative is, what I believe many of us agree here, is some version of a two-state solution.
Yeah, it's very striking these days that Israel is such a fully developed economy, and then you drive an equivalent distance perhaps from here to Georgetown or something, and you're dealing with an economy where the per capita income is 1/10 or less than 1/10 of the size. Husam, do you feel the potential for, I mean, Stav was just talking about this outburst of energy in Israel in 2011 in the social protests. Do you feel sort of pent-up energy in the West Bank among younger people that could get behind a push for peace, or is the idea of one state really what's growing more among social activists in the West Bank?
I don't think the divide in the Palestinian society is the two-staters and the one-staters. I don't think so. And I think the main divide is those who have a sense of hope and a sense of possibility for attaining the two-states solution, and those who think that this is becoming almost an impossibility. And therefore, the second camp would go into different directions, not only the one-state solution, but different assessments. But if I may, Roger, I just heard two key words that has to do with the whole situation in Israel-Palestine. The first is economics, the economy, and the second is security. And I very much agree with the assessment so far, is that there has been too much emphasis on these two words. From an Israeli point of view, the main focus has been security. And the argument goes as if that it's our violence, I mean by our, the Palestinian violence, that provokes the Israeli occupation, not the other way around. Not that it's the occupation that actually provokes some sporadic violence. And this chicken and egg argument has been ongoing until this very moment. Should we discuss borders first or security first? Of course, we always say we should discuss borders first, because we need to know the borders that we are going to protect, or we will get into joint mutual agreements with another state. But the official Israeli argument remains that security comes before agreeing on the territorial side. It was almost a smokescreen and remains to be a smokescreen, this whole security situation. And it's presumptuous to say that in 20 years, the Palestinians might change their minds and call for a one state. So you are a mighty state, and if we change our mind, then you have to deal with it. What if in 20 years, an Israeli government was elected of the very far right, and this government decides to re-invade the state of Palestine and conquer it again. So these presumptuous things should never, ever, Roger, really dictate our today's reality. The second thing is about economics. I mean, Palestine, in my opinion, is given the resources, the location, the human capital, Palestine should be among the middle-income countries in the world. Palestine is robbed its potential not because of the lack of peace, but because of the presence of occupation. Occupation, Roger, robs you, robs the nation, their ability, their potential, their movement. And therefore, it's not just a natural disaster that happens in Palestine that leads to our national, the per capita GDP to be 1,400 in comparison to 34,000 in Israel. That's a huge difference. It's primarily because of occupation. And therefore, I agree with you 100%. The starting point must be the ability of the Palestinian people to rearrange and start this very fascinating journey of nation building and state building on their own. We will make mistakes. We will learn from the mistakes. But I assure you one thing, we have all what it takes to embark upon such a fascinating journey.
We're going to take questions from the audience, from all of you and beyond afterward. And so could you please text any questions to 69866 and then write your question. Thank you.
This conference is just so technological.
We're high tech here. Mikhael,
I heard some things here which are pretty similar, but I want to add another dimension. There's a lot of talk here about despair and hope, also in your opening words, and in the words that, in things which were said by all three previous speakers. I mean, just as well as Stav, it's very hard to know when something erupts and what gets people excited. So we don't know exactly what that will be, but we do know preconditions to what needs to happen in order for people to get excited. And here I think one of our main challenges is actually our own camp. Because as opposed to the issue of the social protests, I think we've internalized in the peace conversation that we're not going to win, meaning we're always going to be in the opposition. We're always going to be the ones who are, it's sort of like our camp has become a huge NGO, which is trying to move the right, which is always going to be in leadership, maybe a bit more to the left. And I think that's probably our largest challenge, because it's very hard to get involved and to get excited and to mobilize by cheerleading the other side and trying to convince them to be a bit less of who they are. And I think it's such a deep challenge and problem of our camp today that if you look at the more, for me, frustrating aspects. So you take an example of, even somebody like Yossi Beilin, who, one of the architects of Oslo, one of the architects of the Geneva Initiative, and literally, and it's important to say, if the people sitting here around the table, I don't think we'd need 9 months of negotiations. The negotiations, we already know in many ways what the format of our agreement should be.
So what would you agree on in a couple of weeks?
No, what is important for me to say regarding that is, and in alluding to Beilin, because we saw recently that he was proposing an interim agreement, some sort of bettering of the status quo for the next 15 years. And he's not doing that because he doesn't have the right solution. He knows a better circumstance. He's doing that because he doesn't think he can get anything better out of the right-wing government. And if we know that, I don't. Because if we know Netanyahu is the primary reason that we don't have a two-state solution end-to-end to occupation, the whole focus of the whole entire camp should be getting rid of Netanyahu. And it shouldn't be trying to convince him to be a bit more like us. So if you want to know about what if you want to know, I mean, in our opinion, what needs to happen, I'd like to see more leaders like Stav who want to end the occupation, who want a two-state construct, and then the whole conversation becomes different because negotiations should be about implementation. They shouldn't be about finding common ground. If we don't have the same common ground, if we don't know where we're going to, the negotiations are pointless. Now, again, we've been through 20 years of this. I was, 13 when Oslo started. I'm aware of all the different maps and all. I'm not interested in sitting in a room and drawing those maps again. We know where we're going, but we need to be in power in order to implement it. And if we can't conceive of ourselves in power, then we're always going to be frustrated. We're always going to be depressed.
But what is often striking in Israel, with the wall barrier and with the fact you don't read a whole lot about what's going on in the West Bank, is this sense of exhaustion, this sense that we can't do it. And you seem to be saying something different, but I often get the feeling in Israel that the belief just isn't there. Or if you ask Israelis, will there be peace? Perhaps a small majority might. If they want a two-state peace, a small majority might well say yes. If you ask them, do you believe in it? Probably no.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, for sure. I'm not saying, God forbid, that we're talking about an easy battle. I'm not saying all we need to do is do something different. I'm asking, what is a battle that we want to fight? Mm-hmm. Where do we want to see ourselves as a camp? And what I'm suggesting is that a precondition of hope is the understanding that you can lead the way and that you're not following and cheerleading the other side. That's my suggestion. Where the left narrowly lost the last election, and the left in Israel, it's not all doom and gloom. Our main focus and our main pressure should be how do we build a comprehensive, coherent, very progressive, very pragmatic camp which can lead the way. And then the questions are about implementation. The questions aren't about what are we talking? The questions are about what are we negotiating in the negotiations? I don't need to have that conversation with any of the Palestinians sitting here. My conversation is a conversation of implementation, and that's the conversation we should be having, but we can only have that conversation from a place of leadership and from a place of political power, which is something that we're not allowed to give up on.
Riman, do you feel that in the West Bank there is a lot of fresh thinking, new voices about the possibility of a two-state peace, or not?
There are always new voices, and I consider myself one of them. And the important thing, though, to recognize at this point, that as the negotiations are happening, it's important to demonstrate to the Palestinian people that there are positive steps being taken. Not that more settlements are being built, not more of the situation becoming worse, but more of, simple things like more running water running into our taps, more easing of movement for Palestinians. That perhaps as the negotiators are talking, they perhaps could decide and agree on some things that can be implemented right now, and not wait until this big euphoric moment replicating the experience of Oslo, after which everything that's bad happened, after which Palestinians started to feel that their basic human needs are being violated every day. So this is on what we all should be doing on the people-to-people level. Also, there needs to be more work being done, more speaking to both publics. Both publics need to get to know each other. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the Israeli government and also some elements on the Palestinian side are preventing this interaction. We have been doing something at IPCRI. We've been bringing buses of Israelis to Palestine for them to see, because their common perception is this big red sign that's at the entry to Areas A, that entering Area A is a danger to your life and is illegal according to Israeli law.
Well, how about getting those signs taken down?
Yes, I'll go for it.
They're terrible signs. Every time I see them, I shudder. It's outrageous.
Yeah, but that's not okay. That's not okay. We've been doing something about that, but that's very much also the responsibility of also the Israeli public.
It's the sole responsibility of the Israelis.
You know, I understand that the social justice movement is important for Israelis, and that it's important for them to fight for their own rights and within their own country, but the whole conversation about the occupation and the connection was absent from the social movements in Israel. So I know that the Israeli public today has no incentive to talk to the Palestinian side. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, there are no bombs going off. And so how do we bring that incentive? How do we speak to the Israeli public? On the Palestinian side, a special committee has been established to interact with the Israeli public. It's called the Palestinian Committee for Interaction with Israeli Public. And
who thought of that name? I agree with you totally. I think it's one of the most striking things is these two communities are not speaking to each other. And moreover, the dramatic changes in the West Bank that have happened in the last 5 years, whether it's security or new developments, they've been scarcely recognized. All the work of Salam Fayyad as Prime Minister, the recognition of this has been, I think, pretty scant in Israel. Do you feel that, Samir? I mean, do you feel that Israelis have a realistic picture of what has happened in the West Bank?
I don't think so. I think the Israelis, after erecting the wall all over the West Bank and the Palestinian cities, especially those who are living in Tel Aviv bubble, they have no idea what exists behind that wall. And for them, they are living, I go to Tel Aviv and I see people, I interact with them there. They live in a state of apathy. They just don't care. They're having...
I mean, apathy with respect to the peace.
To the peace and to the politics and to the Palestine, of course. And I see many of them, they just to pretend to ignore what is behind that wall. And in fact, you know, since the second Intifada started until now, the interaction between the Israelis and the Palestinians was very limited, very limited. The Palestinians used to see the Israelis only as soldiers and settlers, and the Israelis used to see the Palestinians through the media, and they were, you know, imaged as terrorists or extremists and so on. So this is very risky for both people, that the right image of the other does not exist. And I don't think that we will be able to approach peace or to break or to create like a breakthrough in any negotiations or to create a state of pressure on both leaders if the people, if the voters do not know about the other and do not believe that there is the other exists on the other side and has the right to live in dignity and freedom and like any other people.
How would you remedy? How would you remedy that non-communication? How would you address that? There seems to be little interest within the current Israeli government in changing that. Is there anything at the New Voices grassroots level that can be done?
Sure. During the past few months or even the past couple of years, we saw many good attempts by many civil society organizations to try to reach to the other side of the borders, either in Israel or in Palestine. We saw also some serious attempts on social media because now no one can control the borders like before. Social media can reach everywhere. And we used to see social media pages with hundreds of thousands of the Palestinians, Israelis, and even Arabs to speak to each other and interact to each other. But I see there is a bigger problem that makes the barrier. Like in Palestine, we see some attempts by some groups to prevent any kind of interaction between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I believe that there is, as a Palestinian, I have to change the Israelis in order to end occupation. because I cannot speak to the French to end the occupation. The Israelis need to understand that there is occupation and we need to end this. In Israel, it's the same. They need to see that there is a partner on the other side, that there are Palestinians who are looking for peace, that they are there. Now, the biggest problem, the biggest barrier that even bigger than anything else that we're talking about is the negative facts on the ground that are being created on a daily basis. I'll give you an example. In One Voice Palestine, a few days ago before I came here, I was in my office in the center, in the city center of Ramallah, and we were discussing doing something, an activity with the Palestinian youth and politicians in Jenin to speak about negotiations and to support negotiations, which, by the way, is something really unpopular to do in Palestine. And we are the only organization that is doing now this kind of support for the Palestinian leadership. And in the meantime, in the meeting...
Negotiation is unpopular.
Supporting negotiations is unpopular. So in the meantime, while we were discussing this, the Israeli jeeps were right in front of our office. So how can I convince my activists, my staff, my people that hope is still possible? Like everything. And on our way to the activity, you see a new settlement here, a new block there. And so these are the biggest obstacle in front of getting to eat with each other.
Scott, if you were... let me ask you a somewhat difficult question. If you were Prime Minister Netanyahu tomorrow at the White House and you were preparing the Prime Minister's lines and hoping to persuade him to say the most constructive thing possible, what would you recommend? How should the Israeli government be thinking at this point?
I mean, my background is, I grew up in the States and moved to Israel about 10 years ago, and I've been privileged through that time to sort of have a front row seat to what is now being called the startup nation. And what I'd like to see is sort of moving from this short-term, the startup nation is terrific in terms of innovation and building things that we then sell to the rest of the world, but how do you take that and begin to look at your longer-term interests? How do you move from the startup nation to a smarten up nation, where you see things long-term perspective? And I think that plays out in the political spectrum, too, in terms of how our prime minister, how our government reacts to the current situation. How do you see things in the longer term? How do we internalize the challenges that need to be made in order to reach a peaceful solution? And my perspective, frankly, is 20 years as a commercial litigator. And the way I sort of see this, and it's perhaps a little bit simplistic, but there's rarely, in most litigations between commercial parties, there's rarely a good side and a bad side. There's always competing interests, and there's miscommunication. And it gets resolved in one of three ways. It gets resolved in a mediation, where the two parties get together and work out a compromise. It gets resolved in an arbitration, where you bring in outside forces like the US and the EU to sort of move the parties in the right direction. Or sometimes it gets worked out in a litigation, which is an all-out battle. Both sides dig in. It's a zero-sum game. One side wins, one side loses. You never really know the outcome, and I've been fortunate enough to have clients that have actually won, and it turns out to be what feels like spoiled fruit, because at that time you're just completely worn out. So to get to sort of bring that back to your question, I would like for this prime minister to be able to articulate what the long-term version is for peace. And I think it's been on the table for 20 years, and I think we all agree to it. I don't think there is a viable alternative. And it's simply a matter of both our side and the other side recognizing, okay, what are the challenges? What are the compromises we have to make today to get there? Because those compromises aren't going to get any easier in the future. They're going to get harder. And so if we're not willing to make the sacrifice now, the sacrifice will only get passed on to our kids, and it'll become a far more difficult situation to remedy.
But Scott, the way you put it is as if you believe that there is a long-term plan. And from my perspective, and speaking as a person who is, I'm very new in politics. It's less than 6 months that I'm inside the system. And if there's one thing that I learned from being inside that system is that one thing this system is dedicating a lot of effort to do is to maintaining the situation exactly the way it is, with just no option for a possible change. A lot of people in the leadership of Israel are spending a lot of time in keeping the situation exactly as it is. So when you're talking about the long-term plan, the question is the question of a political will. And there is no political will within this government to make this change. It's just not there. The negotiation, the negotiation most of all reminds me for the people who know the history of the short history of the protest movement, of the Trachtenberg Committee, a committee that was established by the government in order to allegedly respond to the needs of what the people raised within the protest movement, the need for social justice. The committee was supposed to write down the policy for social change. And of course, that committee was only about buying time. It was only about procrastinating real change. And I don't want this negotiation to be another committee. I don't want it to be another way of the government to delay and procrastinate decision making. And I think that it's our responsibility to do something about it, to look at this negotiation not just as something that, it's there, we're glad it's there, let's just stand around that room where all the decisions are being made. Tzipi Livni is constantly saying, we're entering a room, we will sit in that room. To stand around that room and do like, go Bibi, go Tzipi, yeah. It's not about us going and encouraging. It's about us putting the limits and defining that we want this negotiation to end with an agreement, not a halfway agreement, not a quarter-way agreement, a real agreement for a long term. And it's our responsibility to do that, because without our voice and without us putting a lot of effort in that, they will just do what they do all the time, and that's keeping the situation as it is.
But Stav, and Mikhael, if you want to come in, let's fully feel your point and sympathize, but let's get real a minute. Most Israelis don't know where the green line is anymore. There are 500,000 Israelis living to the east of it, maybe more. Settlement construction, if you include East Jerusalem, settlement construction is continuing. Prime Minister Netanyahu now is probably a liberal within the Likud movement. Many in the government are far to the right of him. Minister Bennett recently totally dismissed the very notion of a Palestinian state. So how do you, in that situation where the occupation has been going on for decades and its reality is scarcely even recognized anymore by many Israelis, how do you generate that kind of determination that says enough?
I think, first of all of these are reasons, arguments that we hear from the right all the time. We've been hearing them for decades, even at times, and I'm sure that Mikhael can expand on that, even at the time when the settlements were just, a few hundreds of people, we've been hearing the same excuses. It's too big, there is no way to change it. And the right, and especially the Jewish Home Party, are really doing, and we need to give them the credit, an amazing work in convincing the people. But what we have to acknowledge, or maybe changing in our perception, is our perception of a majority. We're very busy in trying to figure out what the majority of Israelis think. Do they know where the green line is? Do they believe in a two-state solution? Do they trust the government? But we have to keep it in mind that the majority, and that's not only about Israel, that's about everywhere, almost. The majority is more inclined to be very used to the situation. The majority is that frog in the boiling pot. It's most of us, most of the public is sitting there very much used to whatever situation that is, and however stuck the situation is, whether it's economically, socially, security, politically, the majority is there. And the role of a leadership and the role of true activism is to go and convince the majority to move just one step aside, to give the majority new picture, a new vision, and a new dream to think about it, believe in. So it's not about us thinking what the majority wants, because the majority is used to the situation, it will leave the situation as it is. Our role is to think how we're going to touch this majority in order to change their mind, in order to convince them that something else is possible.
If I can add to that.
Can I?
Oh, sorry. Do you want to go first?
Well, Husam, you're, and I'll come to you, Mikhael, you're within Fatah. I mean, do you feel inside Fatah a similar investment to what Stav was just describing within the Knesset in the status quo? That for all the talk of bringing change, in fact, the investment in the status quo is huge, and the willingness to change the status quo is small.
Well, this is not about Fatah. This is, I think, it's about the average Palestinian. And
well, Fatah is the leadership.
Well, Fatah is more or less the average Palestinian. Another speaker in the morning said that Fatah is almost the same feeling of a British born and has to be by default or supporting the Manchester United. And then as they grow up, so Fatah is the Manchester United of the Palestinian. Fatah has led...
Manchester United is not doing very well this
season. Yeah, I would go for the Red Sox, actually. Well, Fatah has led the Palestine national movement for 45 years, and it has led us into the armed struggle in the 60s and the 70s, and it has led us into the two-state solution in the 80s, and it has led us to the start of the implementation of the two-state solution in the 90s, and it has led us to the failure of the implementation of the Oslo in the beginning of 2000s, and we were punished by our people in 2006 because we delivered empty promises. And Fatah today, as much as any other movement, as much as the social movement in Israel, is also at a strategic crossroad, really strategic. And I have three things to offer very quickly, Roger. The first is that, I know I dare to say what I'm going to say now, but the fact that we still have to negotiate is bad news. What is it to negotiate? We have negotiated every single thing. Everything you can imagine has been negotiated. There are piles of agreements. If you refer to the Taba talks, you would find final agreements signed by the two sides about everything, including Jerusalem and the refugees. And forget about Taba and the days of Ehud Barak, even under Olmert.
But isn't it bad news that you think it's bad news that you have to negotiate?
No, it's not
because
bad.
Unless you negotiate, how are you going to get a deal?
The problem is negotiation has become acronym in Palestine to a fig leaf, to a smoke screen, to a tool to manage the situation rather than resolve it, to a tool to prolong, entrench the occupation, deepen the settlement. It's a cover-up process. It's a process designed to prevent the outcome. Exactly this. It's a process designed to prevent the outcome. And
so why do you think it could be different this time?
Why do I think it will be different this time? I think this time it's different because everybody involved knows that we do have a very limited window. Everybody realizes that we have a very limited window. You cannot attempt at another 20 years process right now. Everybody realizes that. But let me... I think everybody realizes that. I think everybody knows that we in the Palestinian side have, Mahmoud Abbas, our president, has been really able to be a statement with a vision, has been able to go back to negotiations despite the fact that he has sustained a very serious opposition from his within own party, that is Fatah, and from the PLO Executive Committee. He convinced them, he stood his course, he had his vision unwavering for so many years, and he managed to pull us back to negotiations. And believe you me, Roger, it has been the most unpopular decision in the Palestinian society. But this man, in my opinion, is the last opportunity to implement the two-state solution. Not because the Palestinians after him will not want a two-state solution, but in my opinion, because after him, I fail to see any Palestinian leader who is able to convince the Palestinians of the possibility of a two-state solution. He is so far convincing us. This takes me quickly to my second point. What is the obstacle, really? Michael has touched upon it. What is the real obstacle that has delayed us from reaching where we all want to be, and we know where we want to be, for all these years? What is it? Is it the ignorance and the lack of information and knowledge, and therefore we want more interaction between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that I have to sit with you and convince you? It's important, but I don't think this is the most important side of things. We were living together before the 1987 Intifada and interacting on a daily basis. I remember I was a growing up teenager at the time. I remember half of the Palestinian society speaking Hebrew and singing Hebrew. It's not about interaction. All of a sudden, our per capita income was at the highest at that point in 1987 when the first Intifada erupted. So it's not about the poverty of people, that it's the opposite. When people have money and when people have their priorities sort of sorted, they look at the political aspirations. If it's not about then ignorance, what is it? About what? Fear? Is it the fear? Let's be serious and let's be brutally frank. Is it about the Holocaust and about the collective experience of the Jews and the Israelis? Is Israel an exceptional place? I don't think so. I don't think an insecure society would sustain 717 attacks by settlers against our civilians in the last 7 months. 717 attacks. I don't think an insecure person would do that. I don't think so. But it's an element of it. I understand it's an element of it.
But the Palestinian national movement is divided, and Hamas takes a very different position from Fatah. That is a problem.
It's a serious problem, and I think Hamas...
No, it's not like there are no problems. It's easy.
It's a serious problem, but you want to tell me that this problem is helped by the situation as in terms of the occupation and settlements, or aggravated? You want to tell me that the policies of the state of Israel...
No, it's not helped at all, but in the end, it's a Palestinian issue, reconciliation or not.
I believe that reconciliation must come before agreement with Israel. I believe that we must be united in terms of reaching an agreement.
And why does it keep getting put off?
Well, this is a very long discussion, but it's a very long discussion.
But all of these things are irrelevant, I think, to why occupation continues. And what frustrates me a bit with some of the parameters of this conversation is that we're using heavily the terminology of the right to why things are not moving forward. First of all, the issue of negotiations. Negotiations are not a left-wing concept, and anti-negotiations a right-wing concept. That might have been true in the late 80s. That might have been true in 1994. But since 1996, everybody in Israel believes in negotiations. We even had, I was talking about this in a previous panel, Uri Ariel, who's a radical right minister of housing, said that he's for negotiations as well. He's just against the manifestation of negotiations. So the idea, and this is all public knowledge. So the idea that we keep on saying, let's go to negotiations, and wait a minute, what are the problem for those negotiations? They'll maybe they're not, the camps are separated, so let's, the Palestinians, so let's first unify them, and when they're unified, wait, they have Hamas in the room, so let's separate them. The question is not the question of negotiations. The question is of the fact that there is roughly 50% of Israelis who are not interested in ending the occupation. Now, that's a sad thing, and that's terrible, and I wish that all Israelis would want to end the occupation, but we have to be honest enough and listening enough to understand that there are parts of, and the reason I'm only stressing Israelis and not Palestinians, because within the context of occupation, not the context of a peace agreement, the context of ending the occupation, and these two things are different. In the context of ending the occupation, this is a sole responsibility of the Israeli government. And today we have around 50% of Israeli society, which are represented by their leadership, who are interested in managing that status quo. And if you ask me, I think it's sustainable. I think it's viable. I think it's awful, it's terrible, but I think it can last for a very long time. I mean, it's lasted for a very long time. There's no reason to think that something's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or the day after, and Israelis think that it can happen for a long time. So why are we constantly doing two things? Why are we constantly saying, and you even presented it in your question, you said, if you can say something to Bibi tomorrow, what will you say? So maybe I get that opportunity, and I tell Bibi something. The problem is that there are two problems with that. One, he doesn't want to listen to me because he has a different opinion. And two, even if he does, he has 100 people whispering to his other ear who are saying the thing which is the exact opposite than me. So why do we continue using that track? Why don't we focus all our energy on building our track? And again, this is important for me to state. In the last elections, the right got weaker. The left got stronger. That's not sort of a fantasy of activist optimism, of a new voice. That's numbers, right? The center stayed the same, the right got smaller, the left got bigger. This is a new trend which is happening over the last couple of years, and it's exciting. And it gets me excited because I see
Israel growing more and more religious. Do you really see?
Well, I'm also growing a bit religious, but I know.
Absolutely, But a lot of that opinion is well to the right of yours.
No, I'm aware. We have our Tea Party, and we have our problems, and we have our issues. But
you see a real, genuine chance to build a center-left movement that says, enough of this.
I see a real chance of a center-left party who says, I want to be in power. But I want to ask, what are those stumbling blocks to make that stop happening? And I want to give three. So the first example I gave is the issue of us cheerleading the other side. The second example I want to give is that we're not, on all of this, because of this depression, we're not creating our own language. We're using the right side. We're talking demography. What progressive in the world talks about demographic threat? And we're using that language. We're using that language because we think we will always lose. And we think we need to convince the other side. And the third issue is that we keep on aggrandizing the settlements, and this happened before in the conversation. The settlements is a failure. And in this, I'm not saying they're a failure in the sense that there are a lot of settlers living in the settlements. That's obvious. But they're not sustaining themselves. The only reason they last a day is because we're heavily subsidizing them. That's not true for any other area in the country. It's a weak failure. And instead of us, and the only people who are saying that are the settlers themselves, right? I mean, let's talk about numbers. 67% of settlers work inside Israel. Another 30% of settlers work in government-sponsored jobs inside the settlements. Only 3% of settlers actually have jobs within the settlements that have to be, it's like 1.5% in agriculture and 1.5% in industry. That's insane. It's a failure. And
so why is there a taboo about discussing this?
First of all, we're discussing it right
now. Or
the taboo is not in discussing it. The taboo is how do we create a conversation which is proud of itself.
Even the number is taboo. Nobody knows how much is spent.
Of course. Well, look, there's a lot of, because we work in a think tank and we're trying to get this information out,
well, right.
The right's doing a lot of work to try to hide that information. The right's doing a lot of work to hide that information because they know it's true. So why are we not focusing on making that clear? Why are we not saying, 25% of the roads that the Ministry of Transportation built is within the occupied territories. And that's not only because they know how to mooch from the government more. I mean, they also know how to mooch from the government more. But it's not only because of that. It's because a project doesn't make sense geographically, and we need to put in a ton of money into roads in order for it to make sense. That's a definition of geographic failure. It's weak. You don't need to. You don't even, theoretically, you don't need to evacuate it. You need to turn off the faucet. But the first person who's talking about, the first people who talk about civil wars are the left. We're afraid of us. What civil war? It's not the North and the South. They don't have an army. They don't have hospitals. They don't have a functioning agriculture. They don't have a functioning economy. They're bourgeois more than. But the first thing they hear Israelis say is, there's so many religious people in the army, and they're all becoming religious. And Naftali Bennett, we can't be afraid of the right. We can't be afraid of the right because they're hurting Israeli society, and that needs to be the focus. The focus needs to be not how do we whisper to Netanyahu's ear, but how do we whisper to the ear of the person who we want to be in government, and that should be, again, the focus of the campaign.
Roger.
You know what? I love democracy, but not in the Israeli case. That's because, looking at the Palestinian side, there's sort of one address, and that address can take decisions. Whereas here, we're talking about all this negotiations happening between different parties, coalitions, let's convince the right, let's not convince the right. For us, from the Palestinian perspective, we want the decision to be taken, not to wait for this process to happen. I want to perhaps kind of step back or reevaluate and see whether we have not spoken enough to different groups on both sides, whether we have not listened enough to various groups on the different sides, whether this current separation paradigm that is in place, of an us here, them there mentality of sort of no interaction between the two societies, whether that paradigm will lead somewhere, or whether we need to understand where the settlers are coming from, where some of also the Palestinian, different elements in the Palestinian side are coming from, and try to not to compromise on the very emotional connections that both peoples have. It's very important for all of us that a two-state solution is established. I'm an East Jerusalem Palestinian resident, which means I am no citizen. I am a non-citizen. I'm neither a Palestinian citizen. I'm also not an Israeli citizen. So I stand in limbo. And it's absolutely essential that two sovereign states are established, but it's also important to talk about what the relationship between those two states is. It's important to emphasize the friendly connections that are going to be established between the two states. It's important to emphasize that for the Israeli Jews, they will have the opportunity to perhaps stay in the West Bank, which is also something that the Palestinian Authority has kind of...
As Palestinians.
As Palestinians.
As Palestinians.
What?
As Palestinians?
No, there are arrangements that can be made where they can be Israeli citizens, but Palestinian residents or residents in Palestinian towns. That's the sort of you can be a European voting for the Parisian municipality, but at the same time voting for the national elections in Germany. Let me just continue. I mean, it's also important to acknowledge that we as Palestinians still have a connection to the coastal lines, and that this should be accommodated to. If we build that sort of vision, that we say two-state solution is essential, but the kind of two-state solution is not going to put us in this sort of separation, that is going to guarantee freedom of movement for all, as Palestinian citizens, as Israeli citizens, but with the relations that are sort of, there is a mechanism for this relationship to happen. I think then the fear sort of from both sides of losing something would be mitigated.
Samir, you're here at J Street, and clearly the road to peace, even after your very inspiring intervention, is going to be hard for the simple reason that it's eluded everyone for 65 years. And there are a lot of people heavily invested in blocking it. Secretary of State Kerry said earlier this year that, pleaded really with American Jews, saying that they could make a difference by raising their voices, by saying they believe in a two-state peace, by helping this difficult process along. How do you, here you are at J Street, how do you think that could happen? What would you like to see coming out of the United States, particularly from American Jews, to foster a greater understanding of what Riman was saying, what a Palestinian state could be, what Palestine is, putative Palestine is already?
Well, I believe that there are key players in this equation and this conflict. And one of the most, if not the most important player, is the Jewish community in the United States of America. We know how big the influence of this community on the state of Israel, on the Israeli politicians. We know the internal relations here, also within the American community. We know how it is influential, and therefore it is a Palestinian interest and it's a Palestinian strategy to open such relations with this Jewish community here in order to put things in the right direction. We know without this presence, we know without this support, which I'm really happy about, it will be very difficult to reach an agreement. Every single person has a role to play here. Either, if it's a small or a big role, but every single person can play an important role. And we should all be saying in one voice, and I'm saying one voice because I am representing one voice, and we want all to be one voice, addressing, we all know how it will look like, the final status agreement. It's not like secret, we are not reinventing the wheel. But we need to guarantee that we all unify this vision of the two-state solution. Because I heard too many politicians in Israel speaking about the two-state solution. But we want to tell them or educate them or push them towards the original version of the two-state solution, which is based on on 67 lines with East Jerusalem, etc. Because this is an Israeli interest as it is a Palestinian interest. Because without creating and having a viable and lasting and sustainable Palestinian state, it will collapse. The peace deal will collapse. And this is not an Israeli interest. We want to live as good neighbors. We want to establish a Palestinian state where I can have my national identity, national anthem, my flag, and I want to be a good neighbor to the Israelis where I can visit Tel Aviv with my car, with my son, and the Israelis can come to Ramallah, shop, eat hummus, eat falafel, and even pray in Hebron. But we want to be dealing each other as a based on the mutual respect and mutuality, not based on the relation between an occupied and an occupier.
I'd like to thank you. I would like to just go from you, starting with you, Husam, go down the panel here and just have your honest prediction,
Honest what?
Of where, when the gestation is over, 9 months from now or a bit less, what will come into being, if anything? Where are these negotiations going to lead anywhere? And I'd like you, each of you, honestly to say so, and then maybe we'll turn this open to the audience for some questions. Husam, do you believe this time it'll be different?
I'll attempt at this question, but if you allow me for 1 minute to talk about the J Streets you just asked about it. This is an event, and this is an organization, and this is a gathering that we have been waiting for a long time. It's long overdue. Where I was going in my earlier argument, was it about ignorance or about fear? I think it's about comfort, and I think it's about the balance of power. And I really think that the balance of power is either in Israel is tilting towards the status quo or in Washington is tilting towards the status quo. And the fact that you are here today with this vast number, your commitment and the inspirational speeches I've been hearing, I think this is a game changer as far as the US politics is concerned. And not only a game changer in terms of the very old talk that the two-state solution is the interest of the state of Israel, in the interest of its security and its future. But I heard Jeremy Ben Ami yesterday, and I heard many of you saying that the two-state solution from the point of view of the Jewish communities of the United States is also because Palestinians have rights, and we salute that. For too long, your voices and many of our voices have been hijacked by the very few. And this is the very same situation on the ground. Sir, answering your question. I am not part of the closed doors negotiations. I know nothing about it. But I am on the ground. I see, ever since we started negotiations, what has been happening. And so far, I see Mr. Netanyahu's hands are busy with two things. One, he is trying to show a strong sort of fighting terrorism hand, and the other is busy with building settlements. I don't see he has three hands to sign any peace treaty in. I wish if you can provide him with a third hand, I am happy. And I'm not going to give you boring numbers about what happened in the last few weeks since we started negotiations in terms of settlements. You, Roger, writes about it. You know the numbers, and the audience, I hope, know the numbers here. I believe that the biggest enemy in our way to reach where we want to go is this resignation among the vast majority of the Israeli public. And it's also happening in the Palestinian public. And it's almost being cynical. There is a lot of cynicism. Being cynical, it's a way to justify your inaction. I think what is happening today in this very hall, what happened last year in the United Nations, what happened 2 months ago in the EU, the European Union, and the guidelines that were not just legal. The guidelines were also a political statement of the borders of the state of Palestine from the European Union perspective. And what is happening worldwide in terms of this growing solidarity. And what I heard from the founding member of this very organization, Davido Gilo, yesterday, who said that I wanted an organization not to represent interests, but to represent values, the Jewish values. And by the way, the Jewish values are not different than the Muslim values. They are the very same values. And I heard Davido saying that these values, the significance of the human life, the sacred, the human life, the equality side of it, that you don't expect from your neighbor what you don't want to be brought upon you. I heard the word, and this is where I end. What did you call it? Haneno, Jeremy? Haneno? Haneno? Hanene? Hanene, meaning we're here. I want to tell you here, perhaps on behalf of many, many Palestinians, that if your starting point is values, and values can never be divided, values can never be exclusive, then Haneno, we are here with you as partners, and you have partners. I know I've taken more than my time, but I will end with this saying, very traditional saying, and you really inspired me in the last 2 days, yesterday and today. This saying goes like this: you may have to take life as it is, but don't leave it as it is. Thank you.
That was remarkable, and I'm not sure you answered my question, but I'll let you get away with it. Stav, where do you think we are? What will happen? And let's go down the line fairly briskly, because I've got several questions here. Do you actually believe in these talks?
I have to come back to something that I heard you saying a few times, and I'm hearing it a lot during this conference and in general, and that's that line about, you know, we've been talking about this for decades, been talking about for 65 years. Isn't it already a boring topic to discuss? Is it not? Are we really saying something new? And I don't know, maybe somebody in the audience can tell me how many years the Jews spent dreaming about Israel before it was established. I think it was a bit longer than 65 years. And just imagine that people would say, you know, well, that's boring. It's not interesting anymore. Let's come up with something different. This is nothing. This is 2.5 generations in Israeli terms, which I have to say, when I look back, I can't see a lot of moments in Israel's history where Israel really tried to achieve peace, but really, truthfully, honestly tried. And so I think it's not something that we've already done. It's something that is completely new. We really need to try it. Maybe just once, but really try it. And I think that it's the role of our generation to do that. It's the role of, and without dismissing any efforts of anybody from older generations or from in Israel abroad, but there is something today about young people which was very clear in the last 3 years through various protest movements around the world, really uprisings from the East and the West of people demanding change. And sometimes it's not very clear for them what this kind of change is. You know, we started our protest by talking about housing prices, but very quickly, within 3 or 4 days, we started to discuss a much greater variety of issues, our education system and our legal system and the press in Israel. And we started to talk about not just this one topic or one disease, but the very root of the problem. And I think if you ask different people what they marched for, so people will give you different opinions, but what was very important for everybody was that people wanted to reclaim their state. People wanted to reclaim their rights, to reclaim their future in this country. And if you're asking me whether the negotiation, I'm not going to skip the question, it depends. And it depends on whether people really want it. Because what I see today is 3 parties that none of them is really interested. I see the Israeli side, you know, we'll do everything to procrastinate that. I don't see the lines in the maps. I don't see what we're talking about in the negotiation. Nobody knows what we're talking about in the negotiation. It's not there. It's the discussion is, we know that there is negotiation. We don't know what's going on inside the room. We don't know what are the things in question. And we spent so many hours, days, years negotiating. And I see the Palestinian side also, fragmented political picture, fragmented leadership, and not a very strong leadership, unfortunately. And I see the Americans not putting the basic lines. I mean, there is a lot of passion there, and I really appreciate Kerry's efforts. It's not taken for granted, but I don't see the conditions on the table. I don't see the real questions being asked of the leadership on both sides. What countries do you imagine? How are you going to accomplish, and how are you going to manifest Israel's democracy in the future without a two-state solution? What are you going to do? And I think that putting those conditions on the table is our role. So the negotiation, and this negotiation process will work only if we, as people in Israel, in America, and Palestine, if people will put as much effort as possible, as much passion into fighting for this negotiation to work.
Thank you. I'm going to abandon my question in the interest of taking questions from the audience, because we have a limited amount of time left. And here's the first one. More Americans seem to be joining the BDS movement every day. How do young Palestinians and Israelis feel about this? Riman, maybe you would care to take that one. What about boycott investment?
All right. I think that
let's try and keep these answers fairly brief, because there are quite a lot of questions.
Global boycott may be effective, but not between Israelis and Palestinians, because between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground, I see those people, you know, that I believe in the importance of the connection, and that we cannot afford to leave the seat empty. We need to be there. We need to talk about Palestinian life, Palestinian rights, and our vision, and that needs to be communicated to the Israeli side. As I said, on the global level, this could be influential in lines with what Husam was talking about, of sort of like pushing Israelis to kind of re-examine and look inward about within their own society and what they're doing to the Palestinians.
Thank you. What will be needed to persuade the Israeli public to demand concerted efforts for peace? Scott.
Look, I mean, we've spoken a lot about Bibi today and throughout this panel. It's an issue, and it goes to Samar's point earlier, which is that for the majority of Israelis, and I was thinking about this in coming today, that I'm very much as much part of the problem as the promise, because I very much hope for and wish for peace. But on the other hand, like a fair number of Israelis, we lead a relatively comfortable life. The biggest person on the Israeli side over the last decade, in my view, is not Bibi Netanyahu, it's Stanley Fischer, who created, over the past decade, an economy in which, particularly if you compare it to the US or the EU, where I've been doing business, has been relatively strong. It hasn't stretched as far as it should in terms of full socioeconomic quality. But you know, I see the potential for bringing change. But I also think we have to be, and it's a less inspiring answer than was offered earlier, but we have to be, in one sense, a bit more realistic. And it goes to your question about, will the current negotiations continue? Will we be successful? I don't know the answer to that. But this is a historical family drama. And if I can paraphrase Amos Oz, he said they end in one of two ways. They end in the Shakespearean way or the Chekhovian way. The Shakespearean way is that at the end of the play, the stage is littered with bodies and the play is over. The Chekhovian way is that people are bitter and they're frustrated and they've had to make compromises, but people are alive and they continue the discourse and they hope and they move forward to the next day. And that's the outcome that I'd like to see.
That's the Amos Oz view, right?
Yeah. And he tends to be an optimist. So.
Here's another question. How does negativity and skepticism in the US and your local media contribute to the atmosphere of hope or despair in your societies? Perhaps Mikhael, you would?
I think very much so. I don't know how to say about the American media, but definitely in Israel's more liberal media, I do think we have a challenge with this sort of, for lack of a better word, whiny, we want our country back attitude, which I don't think is very helpful. I think we have to realize that the left, and definitely sort of the classic left in Israel, has to realize that this isn't sort of, an episode in which our country's been taken away and it somehow will be miraculously given back at some point. But we've been in opposition for a very long time, and we need to start thinking about how to do things differently. So I don't think I don't know if papers like Haaretz and Not Only are the ones who are doing it, but they're definitely a symptom of this feeling of, oh, it used to be great, before there were religious people and before the right, and I don't think that's very helpful.
Husam, there's a question specifically for you here. How do you and the rest of the PA inspire hope for two states among Palestinians? And what about the refugee issue? How does that come up vis-a-vis the public, i.e. right of return?
Who asked that question?
And you have to answer these.
I'll touch in 1 minute about the question about BDS. I think this is the wrong question. The question is between violence and non-violence. That's the question. And I think we Palestinians have adopted non-violent means for our resistance. And what is available, and by the way, this is another game changer in our culture, in our strategy, in our practice. And the question then, what is available upon us to balance this vast, disgusting asymmetry between us and the status quo? And then the issue of boycott comes clear. How do you create a bloodless sense of crisis? How do you discomfort the very comfortable status quo? That's the question. This is not about sanctioning or boycotting the state of Israel. This is about sanctioning and boycotting the expansion of the state of Israel.
Okay, now you must answer my question.
Now the question about our offer. I think our offer for the two-state solution is very simple and has been misunderstood several times, Roger. And I think the question is very relevant. I personally believe firmly that our offer to build a state on the 67 borders, which is, as most of you know, 22% of historic Palestine, to vast majority of Palestinians, the 100% is rightly ours, is almost the political realization that this is the only possible solution. And from a Palestinian point of view, it's the maximum we could ever offer the Israelis, and it's the absolute minimum we could accept. And this where we were misunderstood. In the successive Israeli governments, they're dealing with negotiations. For them was not that we start implementing this two-state solution, finding modalities for the implementation, every successive government has been wanting to meet us somewhere between Jerusalem and Jericho, considering that the entire land of the West Bank is disputed. There we went very wrong. And here I want to affirm one thing. I don't believe that there is any Palestinian leader or leadership that can accept less than establishing a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with each Jerusalem its capital with minor border rectification, as happens between so many states.
Okay, just very quickly, the refugee issue, how does that come up in your discussions with the refugee, right of return? How does that come up within the West Bank? What do you hear from Palestinians about it? What does the PA leadership feel about it? It's a big issue.
And therefore, we have to stop this whole real estate haggling about centimeter here and centimeter there. I think the 67 borders are very well known. As for the refugee issue, how do you want me to sign a deal with my own hands that would compromise the rights of 2/3 of the nation that I'm building the state for? How? How am I going to build cohesion and internal peace on such a compromise? And why? The big question is, why do I have to compromise? Let's think for 2 minutes about the issue of refugees. What is it? Let's unpack it. In my opinion, and I said it in the panel earlier, it's the easiest of all issues. I don't think it's the most difficult issue. What do refugees want? And I am one. I am a refugee. I was born in a refugee camp. My parents come from where Israel is now. What do refugees want? They want to hear 4 options. Some of them might want to stay where they are. Some of them might want to resettle somewhere else in a third country. Some of them might want to choose to come back to the state of Palestine. And some of them might want to return to their original homes. But all of them want one thing: full recognition of the Nakba that has been befallen upon them. All of them. My father, if you come to him and ask him, and he was physically kicked out of his home, if you come and ask him and tell him, okay, these are the options, and we fully recognize our part in your Nakba and in your refugee camp, and you have these 4 options, what do you choose? Maybe, I know my father, he will tell you none of the 4 options. I want to stay in Notting Hill, where I'm staying in London, having a good life and walking around. So what he want to learn Hebrew and start all over again? I don't know. But he has to be given the option. It's his right to choose from that option. And I believe based on the new discourse I'm hearing in this, please, let us forego these years of trying to haggle and trying to bargain and trying to predetermine the outcome. Let us focus on these values you said. I think if we focus on the values of justice and fairness, the issue of refugees will be actually the contribution to the future of Israel. Look at this very country and the diversity of this country. I don't think the real obstacle is what you said earlier, Roger, is the 500,000 settlers and their influence, disproportionate influence in the Israeli society, given this sense of lack of activism and pressure from the other side of the Israeli society. And I don't think, by the way, also any Palestinian leader would accept to sign a deal without recognizing this right of return.
Okay, last question, and it's to you, Stav, and it has to be a short answer because you've got 1 minute. And it is this: over the last 5 years, J Street has seriously changed the conversation on Israel, peace, and the Palestinians within the American Jewish community. What would it take for a similar change in dialogue to take place in Israel, where it is most needed?
What?
To change, I don't understand the question.
Well, J Street has changed the conversation in the US about Israel. The notion that you can be a very strong supporter of Israel while being critical of Israel has taken hold. There is a more open debate than there was 5 years ago among the American Jewish community. What would it take in Israel to get a similar change in dialogue, a more open discussion of the real issues?
I think that we need to it's not about convincing with words. It's not about, and you know, before I was a politician, I was a journalist and an activist, and a lot of what I was doing was talking with people, meeting new people, and trying to talk and convince them. And today, I think we need much more action, and we need to stop with that. We talked about it a lot during the panel. We need to stop thinking that we already lost the fight. We need to think that the fight actually starts right now. That it really doesn't matter what was there yesterday. It really doesn't matter what was there 2 decades ago. It matters what we do today. And nothing is going to change unless we do that, unless we stop thinking constantly about the past and all the mistakes, and oh, I wish we've done that, and I wish we did something different. No, we're only starting. It's starting now. And if it's starting now, so just think about it. Try to imagine that nothing happened until now, and we're starting today, at this very second, the real process. We're starting today the change. So what would you do? What would be the first thing to start with? And that's how we need to act.
Well, thank you all very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a fascinating discussion. On behalf of J Street, I want to thank all our guests and our moderator for your insightful and thoughtful remarks. The conference will now break for dinner and evening sessions. Please refer to your programs for tomorrow's schedule. All students should report to their regional breakouts immediately following this session. Please see your inserts for your room number. Advocacy Day training for those who will be joining us on the Hill on Tuesday will start tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Thank you, and have a good evening.